By 1776, approximately 8% of African Americans were free. In the 2 decades after the Revolution, as northern states gradually ended the practice of slavery, many slaveholders in the Chesapeake Bay area freed slaves as well. For instance, in Virginia, the number of free blacks increased from a few thousand before the war to 13,000 by 1790 and 20,000 by 1800. The numbers were more dramatic in Delaware and Maryland, where a higher percentage of slaves were freed, in part because of changing economies that decreased the need for slave labor and immigration by free blacks to Delaware from Maryland and Virginia. By 1810, 75% of blacks in Delaware were free, compared to just over 7% of the blacks in Virginia. By 1810, 4% of blacks in the South, 10% in the Upper South, and 75% of blacks in the North were free. On the eve of the American Civil War, 10% of African Americans nationwide, close to 500,000 people, were free. Most free blacks migrated to cities and towns where they were more likely to find jobs and social and cultural activities, and where they could remain more anonymous. Free blacks worked as carpenters, masons, engineers, merchants, mechanics, tailors, factory workers, household servants, and farmers. Despite many restrictions, some started their own businesses and became factory owners, ran hotels, became barbers and traders. The vast majority of African American men were engaged in manual labor. Although free blacks did not have owners who controlled their movements, state laws and widespread discrimination greatly restricted their freedom. All of the southern and some of the Midwestern states prohibited African American immigration, and other states had laws greatly limiting it. Ohio, for example, required free blacks to post a $500 bond assuring good conduct and means of supporting themselves before they could settle there. Southern states required African Americans to carry proof of their freedom. If they did not possess the correct papers, they could be sold as slaves. Many lived under the constant threat of kidnapping and enslavement. In the South, free blacks had curfews and restrictions against purchasing alcohol and firearms. They were not allowed to testify in a court case against a white person. In Florida and Georgia, free men had to report to white guardians periodically. All of these laws and codes were designed to keep African Americans in a subordinate role in U.S. society. In the North, African Americans were required to have a pass to enter any town in some parts of New England. The rising number of free blacks led to further restrictions of their activities. In almost every state, they were denied the right to vote and hold public office. They were usually excluded from white schools and churches, as well as restaurants, hotels, theaters, museums, and all forms of public transportation. When legal methods failed to sufficiently restrict African American, illegal methods, often violent, were used to discourage attempts by African Americans to exercise rights. While it's important to realize the difficulty of their lives and restrictions placed in their way, it's also vital to acknowledge that African Americans were not defined by these barriers. Across the northern states and through much of the Upper South, once blacks gained their freedom, they went through a process of cultural transformation and creation that was remarkably similar. One of the first things newly emancipated blacks did was to end their most obvious links to the past. Coming up with new names was an important first step. A new name was both a symbol of personal liberation and an act of political defiance. It reversed the enslavement process and confirmed the free blacks' freedom. It was rare to find the free black who clung to the surname of the former master. Early 19th century directories show that African Americans in their freedom preferred English forenames like John and William and Thomas, or Mary or Sally, and such surnames as Johnson, Brown, and Smith. Once freed, African Americans tended to want to leave the site of their enslavement. Slavery had always restricted their physical mobility, and a true test of their freedom was the ability to simply travel and go elsewhere. But practical considerations often affected the former slaves' decision to get away. In the states where slavery remained a legal institution, free persons often had family and friends still in bondage, and even when that was not the case, ties to old homes could remain strong. Naturally, one of the first considerations upon leaving was finding the means to make a living. Few left slavery with more in their possession than the clothes they were wearing, a few rough pieces of furniture, some cooking pots, and a tiny bit of money. Some had no alternative but to hire themselves back to their former masters under conditions that approximated slavery. Even skilled slaves had initial problems leaving home and finding good jobs. But ties to the community and practical matters did not always keep freed slaves in place. Sooner or later, most free blacks moved away. They went in all directions, a few over long distances to Canada and Haiti, many more on short treks to neighboring counties. A steady number of freed African Americans in the border regions of Delaware, Maryland, and Northern Virginia traveled the relatively short distances north, where in Pennsylvania, New York, or New England, their freedom would be more secure. But it was common for former slaves to remain in the general area of their bondage. Yet, if there was a trend in the free black movement, it was toward the growing urban areas where they believed the greatest number of opportunities existed. The free black households that were forming in urban locations gradually moved to areas of the city where other blacks were located, and clusters of black residences emerged. In southern cities, some of these clusters seem to have remained small and separate. In some of the largest northern cities, however, with black family incomes low, these clusters form where housing was cheapest, in southern Philadelphia, for instance, or around the Five Points districts in New York. As free blacks continued to migrate to these areas, they grew into substantial sizes. It was these clusters and neighborhoods that came to be the centers of the free black community. What followed was the establishment of organizations outside of the family, African American churches, mutual benefit societies, and schools that would serve as the community's institutional foundations. African Americans did not enter freedom always intent on establishing their own separate, distinct social institutions, although this sometimes seems to be the case. Most welcomed the opportunity to attend Christian worship services in established congregations and have their children benefit from existing schools. But in these white established institutions, blacks were denied admission or segregated or often treated as inferior. The alternative, therefore, was for blacks to create their own institutions. Mutual aid societies and independent black churches were the first social institutions to appear in the rapidly growing free black communities of the late 18th century. They were closely associated in many cases and became important first in urban areas at about the same time. Poor African Americans first formed mutual aid societies to perform collectively those vital functions that they could not afford to carry out alone: burial of the dead, care of the sick, and support of widows and orphans. They acted somewhat like insurance companies, but providing more direct aid. These societies developed over the first decades of the new nation and soon became an important economic and social organization within black communities. The Newport, Rhode Island African Union Society was the first black mutual aid society. It began in 1780. Philadelphia's better-known Free African Society was established in 1787. Such societies spread throughout the North as the new nation grew, and cities, particularly the larger ones, generally had dozens of such organizations. In 1830, Philadelphia had over 100 African American mutual aid societies with an average membership of 175. Southern free blacks formed mutual aid societies as well, but Southern whites' fear of blacks in any size assembly, for whatever reason, often limited these organizations' ability to grow or function. The general outlook of these societies was somewhat moralistically ideal, a middle-class perspective of getting ahead and a desire to assist those blacks in desperate need. The ranks of these societies were almost universally closed to those unable to lead sober and respectable lives. Enforcement of these strict codes was important, members believed, because those who were newly free needed good role models of behavior and rules for living if they hoped to gain acceptance in society. The independent black church also existed to help its members, socially and economically as well as spiritually. White racism prompted their separate and independent existence. Through the late 18th century, white congregations admitted African Americans to worship services. Most blacks gravitated toward the evangelical denominations, where the only demand for salvation was acceptance of the gospel. Some white congregations even allowed black preachers to conduct services, and in some mixed congregations, blacks and whites shared control of church business. But the trend in white-controlled interracial churches was to include rules and customs that separated the races. When they were permitted to attend the same service as whites, African Americans were often seated separately in so-called Africa corners, and blacks often had to hold baptisms, take communion, or attend Sunday school with members of their own race only. Bothered by this treatment, free blacks began forming their own congregations. Separate black churches popped up here and there across the South, beginning with the Silver Bluffs Baptist Church in South Carolina and the First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia, in the mid-1770s. Separate services for Southern free blacks proved possible in some locations, but independence from white control turned out to be more difficult to achieve. The initial movement toward fully independent black churches took place in northern and border state cities. Two Philadelphia blacks, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, were pioneers in this movement. Both born slaves who later purchased their freedom, Allen, Jones, and a number of Philadelphia free African Americans came to understand that it was impossible for a truly biracial church to exist in Philadelphia. Allen had been a Methodist preacher who had ridden the preaching circuits before settling in Philadelphia. Once there, he drew blacks into the St. George Methodist Church, where the white membership permitted him to preach to blacks at 5 o'clock in the morning. Allen and Jones had been collecting small amounts of money to begin a racially separate, non-denominational church while still attending services at St. George's. But when the physical expansion of St. George's Church building, to which black worshipers had contributed both labor and money, whites decided to segregate the congregation. Out of this exclusion, two separate African American congregations were eventually established: the Episcopal Church of St. Thomas, headed by Jones, and the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. These were in all ways independent black churches. Allen's was open only to descendants of the African race. Only members could nominate ministers for ordination. St. Thomas's and Bethel became models for free blacks wanting to worship as they chose, where they chose and under the direction of whom they chose. Some of the best known African American churches today have their roots in this separatist movement during the early republic. The AME Zion Church was founded in 1800, the Abyssinian Baptist Church in 1804, and St. Philip's Episcopal in 1820, all in New York. The African Baptists, later the first independent Baptist church of people of color, was founded in 1805, and the AME in Boston was founded in 1818. And of course, there are many, many others. Black churches and mutual aid societies played important roles in establishing churches for their children of newly emancipated slaves. For the emerging class of black leaders, education was extremely important. While there was a growing spirit in the North to provide free public education for all youth, African Americans were not included in this 19th century development. In the few places public education existed for blacks, it was separate, of a short term, and unequal. It became fairly clear to free blacks that if they were to rise through education, they would have to provide for it largely themselves. Black church leaders and officers and mutual benefit societies solicited funds and began churches for young blacks. They almost always encountered problems acquiring money for buildings and teachers. In addition, it was often difficult convincing the parents of free black children that education was useful. Most of these parents saw that even with an education, most blacks simply weren't given the same opportunities as their white counterparts. In the South, of course, whites were often openly hostile to black schools. Teachers were often driven out of town. Schools were shut down after slave revolts or rumors of them. Too many slave owners held the position that education was not only wasted on blacks, but might even prove dangerous to the slave system and orderly society. But the schools for free blacks that existed, primarily in the North, during the first half of the 19th century proved to be the training ground for many of the black leaders of this time period. Henry Highland Garnet, the radical abolitionist and political organizer of the 1840s, Samuel Ringgold Ward, another anti-slavery intellectual, James McCune Smith, a physician and perhaps the best-known African-American scholar before the time of W.E.B. Du Bois, all were products of the New York African Free School. In a sense, many whites were right in thinking that education was subversive. It provided the foundation for many of the abolitionist efforts that African Americans would engage in during the 20 years leading up to the war and freedom. Now, it would be naive to suggest that every free black person attended a black school or church or was a member of a mutual aid society. As with all groups and urban populations in particular, blacks engaged in activities that others condemned. Some newly freed persons left their families, took to the sea, traveled for years, and never settled down. Because slavery was so closely associated with working, some equated freedom with never having to work, and these people remained idle and often ended in the public poorhouse or jailhouse. Like whites of the same time period, some members of African American urban communities stole money and goods from whites and blacks, drank too much, abandoned children, fought regularly, and found themselves at odds with the law. What's remarkable, however, is that the vast, vast majority of newly freed African Americans didn't fall into this life and seemed to quickly get along with the business of making their lives and making the lives of their families as livable as possible.